The control panel shook violently as Flight Lieutenant Ray Holmes drove his Hawker Hurricane past 15,000 feet. His Merlin engine roared with its distinctive thunder over the Thames estuary. September 15th, 1940. A date that would become known to historians as Battle of Britain Day. And above London, the sky looked like a nightmare version of fireworks. Tracer fire, black smoke, and planes burning as they fell. Holmes had just fired every last bullet into a Messerschmitt Bf-110, seen it spiral downward, leaking coolant. Normal protocol said return to base immediately for fresh ammunition, but normal protocol assumed your enemy would play by the rules. They weren't playing. Up ahead and slightly higher, a Dornier Do-17 bomber. Luftwaffe crews nicknamed them flying pencils because of their narrow bodies, held a straight line toward the heart of London. Holmes could clearly see the aircraft's cross-shaped tail section, those black crosses standing out against the camouflage. He knew exactly what that bomber carried. 1,000 kilograms of high explosives meant for the London docks, or maybe Buckingham Palace, or any number of vital targets that intelligence said Hermann Goering had marked for destruction that day. The Dornier pilot maintained tight formation, apparently unaware or uncaring that a British fighter had closed to 400 yards behind. Holmes squeezed both firing buttons out of habit. His Browning guns gave him nothing but empty clicks. Bone dry. Not one round left from the 2,660 he'd taken off with from North Weald Aerodrome 40 minutes back. The cold mathematics assembled in his head. The Dornier was doing roughly 180 miles per hour. On its current path, it would enter London's dense urban area in about 4 minutes. Holmes searched the sky for backup. Any backup. But the closest hurricane was wheeling 2 miles away, locked in its own fight. Nobody else would reach this bomber in time. Fighter Command's rules were crystal clear in situations like this. Pull back, head to base, reload, rejoin the battle. Throwing away experienced pilots on pointless suicide runs served zero strategic value. After 3 solid months of non-stop fighting, the RAF had fewer than 700 fighter pilots defending the entire country. Every squadron leader had buried friends. Every pilot knew the numbers. Britain couldn't afford to waste trained men on empty gestures. Still, Holmes didn't bank away. He pushed the throttle forward, cutting the distance to 200 yards, his mind working through angles no training manual ever covered. The Dornier had defensive guns. That dorsal gunner would definitely start shooting if Holmes got much closer. But without ammo, closer was his only play. The bomber crew had families back in Hamburg or Munich wanting them home safe. Holmes had a wife in Croydon who wanted the same thing. Somebody was about to lose. Below, London stretched out in the late afternoon sun. 7 million souls. The docks, the hospitals, underground stations crammed with civilians taking shelter. Holmes had flown over the East End just last week and seen whole streets erased, rows of houses simply gone, replaced by smoking craters and rescue teams digging through rubble. The papers called them incidents to keep spirits up, but pilots saw reality from above. Every bomber that made it to the city centre delivered death by the ton. The Dornier held steady, confident. Its pilot likely figured the hurricane was out of bullets and would break off. A sensible assumption. A logical one. Holmes's hand gripped the throttle, and he made a choice that threw both sense and logic out the window. If bullets couldn't down this bomber, maybe 3,000 kilograms of hurricane could. He maxed the throttle to emergency combat power and lined up on the Dornier's tail. Ray Holmes wasn't some reckless hothead. This 25-year-old from Liverpool had joined 504 Squadron as a sergeant pilot back in 1938, when the RAF still flew biplanes, and most officers thought the next war would look like the previous one. He'd logged over 600 flight hours before the first Luftwaffe raid crossed the Channel. more seasoned than half the green replacement pilots, showing up weekly at Fighter Command squadrons. His logbook showed a methodical flyer, careful on approaches, precise information. The type who double-checked his parachute harness, the type who made it home, which made what came next all the more extraordinary. Holmes closed to 50 yards off the Dornier's tail, near enough to watch the German rear gunner swinging his MG-15 machine gun around. The geometry demanded precision. Too shallow an angle, and he'd just bounce off. Too steep, and both planes would shatter. He needed to hit hard enough to wreck the bomber's controls while keeping some slim chance of surviving himself. The Hurricane's thick wings could take tremendous abuse. The Dornier's tail couldn't. At 20 yards, the German gunner opened fire. Tracer rounds flashed past Holmes's canopy, one punching clean through his windscreen and out through the fabric behind his seat. He didn't even flinch. He was already committed. The Hurricane's propeller, spinning at 2,600 RPM, became a 3-foot circular saw. Holmes aimed it like a precision instrument at the Dornier's elevator, the horizontal surface controlling pitch, impact. The propeller tore through aluminum and frame with a sound Holmes would later say resembled ripping canvas, only much louder. His Hurricane bucked violently, the nose jerking upward as debris peppered his engine cowling. The Dornier's entire tail assembly twisted, then broke away. The bomber's nose immediately pitched into a fatal dive. The pilots inside now commanded a 10-ton glider with the aerodynamics of a dropped brick. Holmes wrestled his own controls as the Hurricane began an inverted spiral. Chunks of German aircraft stuck in his propeller created catastrophic imbalance. The Merlin seized. Oil pressure hit zero. Holmes was now gliding, really falling, over central London in a fighter that handled like a broken shopping cart. At 8,000 feet, he unfastened his straps and rolled the aircraft upside down, dropping clear. His parachute opened at 5,000 feet. He watched his Hurricane slam down near Victoria Station, while the Dornier punched through the roof of Victoria Railway Station itself, its bombs mercifully failing to explode. Holmes touched down in a Chelsea garbage bin. The incident report filed by Wing Commander Douglas Bader, Holmes's direct superior, made for fascinating reading. Bader himself, notorious for aggressive flying, described the ramming as effective utilization of aircraft as weapon following ammunition depletion. Not reckless, not suicidal, effective. The report reached Air Vice Marshal Keith Park's desk at 11 Group headquarters within hours. Park, who commanded all RAF fighters protecting London, had spent 3 months watching German bombers pound his city while his outnumbered squadrons bled pilots dry. The official RAF stance condemned ramming as wasteful. Park read Holmes's report 3 times. Then he picked up the telephone and called each of his squadron commanders. These conversations weren't preserved in official records, but squadron diaries and personal letters reveal what was said. Park didn't give orders. He posed hypothetical situations. If a pilot runs dry on ammunition with a bomber heading for critical infrastructure, and no other fighters can intercept. He left the rest hanging. Squadron leaders got the message. The decision belonged to individual pilots, but Fighter Command would no longer court-martial survivors who made Holmes's choice. Within a week, word traveled through every dispersal hut, from Kent to Northumberland. The crazy bastard who rammed a Dornier over London hadn't just lived. Command had labeled it effective tactics. The reasoning became obvious when you examined Fighter Command's casualty books. Between August 8th and September 18th, 1940, the RAF lost 295 pilots killed or missing, with another 171 wounded, badly enough to pull them from combat. Training schools churned out replacements at roughly 280 pilots monthly, adequate in peacetime, catastrophic during the Battle of Britain's peak intensity. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, running fighter command from Bentley Priory, faced mathematics that allowed no optimistic spin. At current loss rates, he'd run out of experienced pilots by November. The Luftwaffe understood this. So did Winston Churchill. The strategic calculations got bleaker when you considered what those pilots defended. Intelligence estimates put Reichsmarschall Goering's assembled force at 2,800 aircraft across French and Belgian airfields. Bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes, all aimed at Britain's southern coast. Against this armada, Dowding fielded roughly 650 serviceable fighters on any given day, spread across 46 squadrons. The Germans could lose 3 aircraft for every British fighter and still win air superiority. They were trying for exactly that exchange rate. Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's invasion blueprint, waited in the Channel ports. Aerial reconnaissance photographed 1,900 barges gathered between Rotterdam and Le Havre, enough to transport 260,000 troops in the opening wave. The Royal Navy would slaughter those barges if they attempted a crossing, but only if the Luftwaffe didn't own the skies. Naval vessels couldn't function under sustained air attack, as the Norwegian campaign had brutally demonstrated in April. Everything hung on fighter command, maintaining air dominance over the Channel and southern England. Everything, which made every German bomber reaching London or Coventry or Southampton a tactical failure. Each successful raid killed civilians, certainly, but more critically, it proved to German planners that Britain's air defences had holes. That invasion remained possible. That Britain could be bombed into surrender. Churchill's speeches about fighting on beaches and landing grounds meant nothing if the RAF couldn't stop bombs falling on those very beaches and grounds. Dowding grasped a harsh calculation that peacetime military thinking never addressed. A Hurricane cost £6,000 to build, roughly 14 months' wages for a skilled factory worker. Training a replacement pilot cost approximately £10,000 and required 6 months minimum, often longer to develop combat proficiency. A Dornier Do, 017 bomber cost the Germans roughly 250,000 Reichsmarks and carried a 4-man crew, each representing months of specialized training. But that bomber could deliver 1,000 kilograms of high explosive onto a factory, producing Hurricane components, or a power station supplying electricity to aircraft manufacturers, or a residential area whose continued destruction might shatter civilian morale. The exchange rate wasn't fighter versus bomber. It was potential future production versus immediate threat elimination. Park's 11 Group, defending London and the southeast, absorbed the heaviest beating. His pilots flew 4 or 5 missions daily, scrambling the instant radar picked up incoming raids. They landed, rearmed, refueled, and launched again, often eating cold sandwiches in the cockpit while ground crews worked. Exhaustion killed as efficiently as enemy fire. Pilots dozed off during debriefings. Some crashed on landing because fatigue slowed their reactions by fatal fractions of seconds. Into this grinding war of attrition, Holmes's ramming attack introduced a variable conventional tactics hadn't accounted for. If a pilot's ammunition ran dry, an increasingly common occurrence as dogfights grew longer and more desperate, the pilot himself became a weapon of last resort. Not necessarily a suicide weapon, Holmes had survived, but a weapon nonetheless. One that couldn't be manufactured in factories or trained at schools. A weapon composed entirely of will and calculated desperation. High Command faced a choice between condemning such actions as violation of regulations or acknowledging that regulations written for peacetime no longer applied when national survival depended on split-second pilot decisions at 15,000 feet. The physics of deliberate aerial collision violated every principle drilled into pilots during training. Aircraft structures, whether British or German, were fundamentally aluminum alloy stretched over tubular frames. engineering marvels designed to handle aerodynamic loads, not concentrated impact forces. A Hurricane's empty weight approached 2,400 kilograms. A fully loaded Dornier weighed nearly 9,000 kilograms. Newton's laws regarding momentum and energy transfer suggested any collision between such masses at combined closing speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour would produce mutual destruction. Yet survival remained possible if pilots understood structural vulnerabilities and attack vectors. The key was asymmetric targeting. A bomber's tail assembly, the empennage in technical terms, represented its most vulnerable structure. The vertical stabilizer and horizontal elevators were essentially fabric-covered frameworks attached to the fuselage by relatively fragile mounting points. These surfaces controlled yaw and pitch, making them absolutely essential for controlled flight. Sever them, and even an otherwise undamaged bomber became uncontrollable. Meanwhile, a Hurricane's wing leading edge incorporated substantial structural ribs designed to handle stress loads during high-speed maneuvers. Those ribs could function as crude cutting implements. Squadron engineers who examined Holmes's Hurricane wreckage noted his propeller had absorbed the initial impact, the three-blade assembly shattering but dissipating enormous kinetic energy in the process. The propeller essentially functioned as a sacrificial buffer, destroying itself while protecting the engine, mounting, and forward fuselage structure. This observation proved crucial. Pilots attempting ramming attacks learned to aim their propeller disc, that circular area swept by spinning blades, at bomber tail surfaces. The propeller would disintegrate on contact, but not before chewing through control surfaces like an industrial grinder meeting cardboard. Approach angle mattered desperately. A head-on ramming attack, while dramatic, guaranteed mutual annihilation. Closing speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour meant both aircraft would essentially vaporize on impact, releasing kinetic energy comparable to detonating several hundred kilograms of TNT. No pilot survived such exchanges, making them genuinely suicidal rather than merely desperate. The optimal technique involved overtaking the bomber from slightly below and behind, a pursuit curve that positioned the fighter's propeller against the target's tail while allowing the attacker's forward momentum to carry him through and past the collision point. Physics textbooks would call this an oblique, inelastic collision, though inelastic understated the structural damage. The fighter essentially performed a high-speed cutting pass, sacrificing propeller and engine, but potentially preserving the airframe's basic integrity. If the pilot maintained control through the violent shuddering following impact, he might glide to a forced landing or bail out at survivable altitude. Might. Wingtip strikes offered another option, particularly against bombers flying in formation. A Hurricane's wingtip, while sturdy, was expendable. The primary wing spars ran closer to the fuselage, providing structural integrity. A pilot could theoretically sacrifice his outer wing section by striking a bomber's wing or engine nacelle, destabilizing the enemy aircraft while retaining enough wing area to maintain controlled flight. Group Captain Peter Townsend documented one such attempt in October 1940, striking a Heinkel He-111's port engine with his Spitfire's starboard wingtip. The Heinkel's engine tore away from its mounting, streaming, burning oil. Townsend lost 3 feet of wing, but landed successfully at Gravesend. The critical calculation involved energy management. A fighter traveling 50 miles per hour faster than its target possessed kinetic energy proportional to velocity squared. That energy had to go somewhere upon impact. Pilots learned to bleed off excess speed before contact, reducing relative velocity to perhaps 20 or 30 miles per hour, still enough to inflict structural damage, but potentially survivable. This required extraordinary judgment. Too slow and the attack lacked destructive force. Too fast and survival became impossible. Fighter Command operated through a peculiar communication network that official signals never captured. pilots rotated between squadrons. Ground crews exchanged stories during maintenance shifts. Every dispersal hut contained the same battered furniture, where exhausted men waited for the next scramble order. Word of Holmes's ramming attack reached every operational fighter station within 72 hours, transmitted through this informal network faster than any official dispatch could achieve. The initial reaction mixed disbelief with morbid fascination. Squadron leader Tom Gleave, commanding 253 Squadron at Kenley, recalled an evening conversation on September 18th, where a newly arrived pilot asked if the Victoria Station ramming story was real or fighter pilot mythology. 3 veterans confirmed its authenticity. One added that Park's office hadn't court-martialed Holmes. Another mentioned engineering officers at North Weald had examined the wreckage and calculated optimal impact angles. The conversation grew quieter. Someone asked whether anyone present would attempt such an attack. No one answered directly, but neither did anyone say no. The second documented ramming occurred on September 27, 1940. Sergeant Thomas Alderson of 72 Squadron, flying a Spitfire out of Biggin Hill, exhausted his ammunition during combat with a formation of Heinkel He-111s over Maidstone. One bomber, already damaged and trailing smoke, turned north toward London rather than retreating across the Channel. Alderson later reported he'd watched the Heinkel's bomb bay doors remain closed. The aircraft clearly intended to reach London before releasing its load. He made 3 mock attacks, hoping to frighten the crew into jettisoning bombs over countryside. They didn't. Alderson positioned his Spitfire above and behind the Heinkel, then dove onto the bomber's vertical stabilizer. His propeller severed the tail structure completely. The Heinkel entered a flat spin. Alderson's engine seized from impact vibrations, forcing him to bail out over Dartford. He landed in a cricket pitch, walked to the nearest phone box, and rang Biggin Hill requesting transport. His squadron commander's report described the action as necessary destruction of enemy aircraft by unconventional means. By early October, Fighter Command intelligence officers had documented 6 separate ramming attacks. Not all succeeded. Pilot Officer David Crook of 609. Squadron attempted to ram a Dornier on October 5th, but misjudged his approach speed, striking the bomber's fuselage rather than tail. Both aircraft disintegrated. Crook's body was recovered near Sevenoaks. The Dornier's crew died in the wreckage. Such failures reinforced the technique's deadly nature, but notably, they didn't prevent others from attempting similar attacks when circumstances demanded. The spread followed predictable patterns. Experienced pilots who'd flown with Holmes or Alderson shared technical observations during mess dinners, how Holmes had aimed for the elevator hinges specifically, how Alderson had approached from above to maximize gravitational assistance. These weren't formal briefings. No one distributed written instructions on ramming technique, but knowledge transferred nonetheless. A pilot might mention casually that propeller strikes seemed more survivable than wing collisions. Another would note that bailing out immediately after impact improved survival odds compared to attempting a forced landing with damaged controls. Squadron photographers documented the phenomenon inadvertently. Combat footage from October 1940 shows a Hurricane making an unusually close approach to a Junkers Ju-88, the fighter's nose nearly touching the bomber's tail before both aircraft disappear into cloud. The footage ends there, but squadron records note the bomber crashed near Ashford, while the Hurricane pilot returned to base with a bent propeller and cracked engine mount. Perhaps most telling, pilots stopped expressing surprise when ramming incidents occurred. By late October, a sergeant pilot might return from patrol, report ramming a bomber after running dry on ammunition, and receive nods of acknowledgement rather than gasps of shock. The tactic had normalized with disturbing speed. Air Ministry bureaucrats faced a delicate problem. Official military doctrine, codified in Air Publication 1480 and various Fighter Command tactical memoranda, made no provision for deliberate aircraft-to-aircraft collision. The closest reference appeared in emergency procedures. In the event of ammunition exhaustion, pilot will disengage and return to base. Ramming attacks violated this directive explicitly, yet court-martialing pilots who destroyed enemy bombers while following Park's unspoken guidance would create a morale catastrophe and potentially trigger parliamentary inquiry. The solution emerged as bureaucratic masterpiece. Publicly, the Air Ministry maintained that ramming represented dangerous deviation from approved tactics. A terse statement released to newspapers on October 8th characterized such actions as individual initiatives not reflective of fighter command doctrine. The phrasing was deliberate, neither condemning nor endorsing, occupying a carefully constructed gray zone that preserved official policy while avoiding criticism of pilots who'd eliminated enemy aircraft. Privately, a very different conversation occurred on October 12, 1940. Wing commanders from 10 Group, 11 Group, and 12 Group received summons to a conference at Fighter Command Headquarters, Bentley Priory. The meeting agenda, preserved in Group Captain John Willoughby de Broke's personal papers, listed topics including pilot rotation schedules and ammunition conservation. The final item read simply, "Tactics discussion, miscellaneous." No minutes were recorded for this portion of the meeting. De Broke's diary entry for that evening proved more revealing. Dowding asked pointed questions about ammunition exhaustion scenarios. Park described Holmes' incident in technical detail. Discussion followed regarding structural mechanics and survivability factors. No formal conclusions reached, but guidance clearly implied. The careful language spoke volumes. Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, wasn't issuing orders. He was ensuring squadron commanders understood that pilots who attempted ramming attacks wouldn't face disciplinary action, provided such attempts occurred only after ammunition exhaustion and against bombers threatening critical targets. Squadron leaders translated this guidance into dispersal hut conversations. Flight Lieutenant James Leithart of 54 Squadron recalled an October briefing where his commanding officer addressed ammunition management, then added an apparently offhand comment. Should you find yourself without rounds and facing a bomber bound for vital targets, remember your aircraft weighs considerably more than its tail assembly. The pilots understood. No one asked for clarification. Engineering officers received their own quiet instructions. After ramming incidents, they were to examine wreckage thoroughly and document structural failure points, ostensibly for accident investigation purposes, but the resulting reports read more like targeting analysis. A technical memo from RAF Maintenance Unit 12 described how hurricane propeller blades, when impacting aluminum control surfaces at specific angles, produced predictable catastrophic failure in target structure while potentially preserving attacker airframe integrity. This wasn't accident investigation. This was weapons research. Survival protocols developed organically. Pilots who successfully rammed bombers and survived received immediate medical evaluation, regardless of apparent injury severity. The concern wasn't merely physical trauma, but psychological assessment. Medical officers needed to determine whether the pilot could return to combat duty or whether the ramming experience had inflicted mental damage precluding further flying. Most pilots returned to operations within days. A few requested transfers to non-combat roles, requests granted quietly without prejudice to their service records. The Air Ministry established an unwritten policy regarding decorations. Pilots who survived ramming attacks received recognition, but citations carefully avoided describing the ramming itself. Holmes eventually received the Distinguished Flying Medal, but his citation, as mentioned, repeated acts of gallantry and determination without specifying the Victoria Station incident. The omission was intentional. Formally recognizing ramming attacks would transform them from desperate expedient into approved tactics, requiring doctrinal revision that peacetime regulations couldn't accommodate. Documenting ramming attacks proved frustratingly difficult for historians because Fighter Command never maintained official records of such incidents. Combat reports used euphemistic language, close-range engagement resulting in collision, or target destroyed by unconventional means, that obscured what actually occurred. Pilots who died in ramming attacks couldn't file reports, and survivors often downplayed their actions in debriefings, aware that admitting to ramming might provoke uncomfortable questions. Reconstructing the actual number requires cross-referencing squadron diaries, crashed aircraft investigation reports, and witness statements from ground observers. Beyond Holmes's Victoria Station attack, at least 4 other ramming incidents during autumn 1940 achieved sufficient documentation to verify details. On September 30th, pilot officer Eric Barwell of 111 Squadron engaged a Junkers Ju-88 over the Thames estuary. After exhausting ammunition, Barwell rammed the bomber's starboard engine, tearing it from its mounting. The Ju-88 crashed into the estuary near Shoeburyness. Barwell's Hurricane sustained catastrophic engine damage, forcing him to ditch in shallow water near Foulness Island. He scrambled from the sinking aircraft with nothing worse than bruised ribs and mild hypothermia. The Ju-88 had been carrying roughly 800 kilograms of high explosive destined for London docks, ordnance that would have demolished multiple warehouses and potentially killed dozens of dock workers. Flight Sergeant William Franklin achieved perhaps the most tactically significant ramming on October 15th. Franklin, flying with 603 Squadron, intercepted a Heinkel He 111 approaching Portsmouth Naval Dockyard at dusk. Intelligence had warned the Luftwaffe considered Portsmouth a priority target. The dockyard contained 3 capital ships under repair and housed the Royal Navy's primary southern maintenance facilities. Franklin's ammunition ran out after destroying the Heinkel's dorsal gunner position. Rather than breaking off, he closed to ramming distance and drove his Spitfire's wing into the bomber's tail assembly. The Heinkel went down in Portsmouth Harbour. Franklin bailed out, landing in a residential garden where the homeowner served him tea while they waited for military transport. The 3 capital ships at Portsmouth continued repairs unmolested. Not all attackers survived. On October 27th, Squadron leader Kenneth Gillies of 616 Squadron attempted to ram a Dornier Do 215 over the Midlands industrial belt. Witnesses observed Gillies's Hurricane strike the bomber's fuselage rather than tail section, a fatal error. Both aircraft exploded at 9,000 feet. Gillies was 32 years old and had scored 7 confirmed victories. The Dornier's 4-man crew perished as well. Investigation of crash debris suggested the bomber carried incendiary ordnance targeting Coventry's aircraft factories. Those factories continued production. The most controversial ramming occurred on November 7th, when Sergeant Antoni Glowacki, a Polish pilot flying with 501 Squadron, exhausted his ammunition while engaging a Heinkel formation over Southampton. Glowacki rammed the trailing bomber, destroying its tail completely. He bailed out successfully. However, the stricken Heinkel crashed into a residential street in Southampton, killing 5 civilians when its bomb load detonated on impact. The incident sparked brief controversy in Parliament. Had Glowacki's action saved lives by preventing a bombing run, or caused deaths that might not have occurred if he'd simply broken off? Air Ministry representatives argued reasonably that the Heinkel would have dropped its bombs regardless, likely killing far more than 5 people. The matter was quietly dropped. Calculating the total explosive tonnage prevented by ramming attacks requires estimation. The 5 documented incidents involved bombers carrying between 1,000 and 2,000 kilograms of ordnance each, approximately 7,500 kilograms total. By comparison, the Coventry Blitz on November 14, 1940, involved roughly 500 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs, killing 568 civilians and destroying 4,330 homes. Every ton prevented represented lives saved. The ramming tactic's operational lifespan measured barely 3 months. By December 1940, the combination of technological advancement and strategic reality rendered such desperate measures largely unnecessary. The factors that made ramming viable and occasionally necessary evaporated as fighter command's tactical situation improved and the Luftwaffe's changed dramatically. The first shift involved ammunition capacity. In November 1940, RAF armourers began loading Hurricane and Spitfire ammunition boxes to absolute maximum capacity, rather than the conservative loads used earlier to reduce weight. Additionally, squadron commanders instituted stricter fire discipline training. Pilots learned to close to 200 yards before firing, rather than opening up at 400 yards where most rounds missed. These simple changes meant pilots exhausted ammunition far less frequently. If a Hurricane carried 2,660 rounds and the pilot fired only when hits were probable, those rounds lasted considerably longer than when sprayed hopefully at distant targets. Radar coordination improved substantially. By January 1941, chain home stations could vector fighters onto bomber formations with sufficient precision that interception occurred earlier, often while German formations were still assembling over the Channel. This gave RAF pilots more time to engage and more critically meant bombers faced harassment throughout their entire approach, rather than only in the final minutes before reaching targets. Bombers harassed early often jettisoned bombs prematurely or turned back, making ramming unnecessary. The Luftwaffe's strategic pivot proved most significant. After failing to destroy fighter command or break civilian morale through daylight bombing, German planners shifted to night operations. The Blitz continued through May 1941, but darkness fundamentally altered aerial combat dynamics. Night fighters relied on different tactics: radar-guided interception, searchlight cooperation, ground-controlled approach. Ramming became impractical when pilots could barely see their targets, let alone execute the precise positioning ramming required. Night fighting emphasized instrument flying and patience rather than desperate close-range attacks. Fighter command's numerical strength recovered as well. Training schools that had struggled to produce 280 pilots monthly in September 1940 were graduating 350 by February 1941. Simultaneously, Luftwaffe losses mounted. The Germans lost approximately 1,800 aircraft during the Battle of Britain, losses they couldn't rapidly replace given production bottlenecks and competing demands from the Eastern Front after Operation Barbarossa commenced in June 1941. The desperate arithmetic that made ramming thinkable in September 1940 no longer applied by spring 1941. Official histories barely mentioned ramming attacks because admitting their necessity revealed how close fighter command had come to defeat. Post-war narratives emphasized technological superiority: radar, the Spitfire's capabilities, British industrial resilience. Acknowledging that pilots resorted to using their aircraft as weapons suggested desperation that contradicted the triumphalist narrative. Holmes's Victoria Station ramming appeared in some accounts, but usually framed as isolated heroism rather than tactical evolution. The veterans themselves rarely discussed ramming. Those who attempted it and survived generally described the experience as terrifying necessity rather than gallantry. Holmes, interviewed decades later, characterized his decision as the only thing that made sense in the moment, rather than conscious heroism. He'd seen a bomber heading for London with no other way to stop it. Simple as that. The calculated risk, the survival odds, the implications, those came later. In the moment, there was only geometry and consequences. By mid-1941, Ramming had disappeared from Fighter Command's tactical repertoire, surviving only in dispersal hut stories told to replacement pilots. It represented something the RAF preferred not to examine too closely, evidence that victory in 1940 had required not just courage and technology, but calculated willingness to transform men and machines into expendable weapons. That desperation, however briefly necessary, sat uncomfortably alongside narratives of inevitable British triumph. So it faded, remembered by those who'd lived it, forgotten by official history, a footnote to survival.